us, huh?
No, we might be live right now. In fact, if we are, good morning, friends.
Now it says live on Facebook.
Oh, so we're probably live on Facebook now. Uh,
I'll check.
I'm pretty sure we're there. Hey, friends, if you've been with us on Facebook Live on Sunday mornings before, you know there's always this awkward 30 seconds while I get a couple things configured while we get started.
We are live. I see us.
We're out there. That's awesome. Well, hey, good morning, friends. Our fellow Southampton City Church member and friend Jake Titus is with us. More about that in a moment, and we're going to get into a conversation that I'm really excited to share with you. Before we do that, so a couple of things that I want to make sure are on your radar. First of all, tonight we're back at Four Winds Field. This is the last week of our Sundays at 6:30 p.m. at Four Winds Field, and it's the last week of our series that we call Sacred Questions. And so we'd love to see you there. It's going to be beautiful. It might be a little chilly, so you might want to bring a sweater or something. And then next week, we don't have Four Winds Field. Instead, we're doing the tailgate at Studebaker, 6:30 p.m., just like the gathering times. And we're going to have Temper Grill coming alongside us. Our brother Sean Kelly is doing some cooking. We got smash burgers, Impossible Burgers, and hot dogs. And if you're able to make a donation to cover the price of your meal, or maybe even to cover the price for somebody who can't, you can kick in some extra. But we want everybody to enjoy the meal together, regardless of whether you're able to or not. But we need everybody to register because we need to know how much food to have. So go to southamptoncitychurch.com and let us know you're coming. And we'd love to see you next Sunday night at 6:30 p.m. This week, middle school and high school tables are launching at 4:30 p.m. In the parking lot at 112 over at our church space. We've got fire pits. Students can be outdoors. It'll be a COVID appropriate way to be together. And student tables are a really great gift for middle schoolers and high schoolers. Student tables are a way for students to connect with peers and with trustworthy adults who can walk with them in faith and life. You should know that we take the same care in selecting and training our student table volunteers that we do in selecting and training kids ministry volunteers. So background checks and really clear protocols to make sure that our volunteers are equipped to make sure your students have a really safe and appropriate experience. So anyway, if you want to be a part of that, if you are a middle schooler or high schooler, or if you know one, we'll need you to register. You can go to southamptoncitychurch.com/tables. And when you click on the link to go to the directory, you'll see our adult tables listed, which are open for joining too. But you'll see there's a middle school table and a high school table, and you can sign up there. Good morning, Angela. Good morning, Nessa. Good morning, Pat. Tables, we covered the tailgate. Oh yeah, one more thing, which is when we come back to Four Winds Field on Sundays in October, we are going to be at 11 a.m. for those gatherings in October. We're going to take advantage of the sunshine, and hopefully 11 a.m. is a better time for families that are dealing with bedtime with kids in the house and having a hard time making it to the 6:30 gatherings. So again, 6:30 p.m. tonight at Four Winds. Next week is the tailgate at Studebaker, and then in October, we're Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. I think that's all the news. Now Jake is here. Hey, Jake.
Hey.
So friends, if you don't know Jake Titus, Jake and his wife Kristen are members of our church community. And Jake, tell us a little bit about your work in general, and then we'll get into what we're talking about today.
Yeah, so I make, I do projects in and about South Bend. Those take varying forms, but I often fall into a design and writing role these days. Sometimes photography is what I guess people think of me a little more as, but yeah, and I have a blog.
Where does skateboarding fit into that portfolio?
Yeah, it was a growing part of the portfolio, but broke my ankle on Monday, and so it's not a part of the portfolio for at least 6 months.
Yeah, neither is like walking or.
Yeah, walking is not part of the portfolio for 2 months, at least. Yeah, so yeah. I will walk in at least 2 months.
So you're coming to us today, slightly medicated with your leg up in a cast.
Yeah, I'm waiting for surgery. So the bones are all still broken, and Yep, I spend 24 hours a day in this chair, and
Well, you look good for that. You look good in spite of all that. Um, all right, so we're here today to talk about a project that you have been sharing with the world that I just think is really helpful. So I'm going to give a little background from my end and then kind of kick it over to you.
mm,
I know that, like, as a person who's tried to be a student of South Bend in the last few years, there's this narrative that you really quickly latch onto, which is basically like, South Bend had these golden days, this golden age that was sort of up to and including the early 60s. But then Studebaker shuts down, and with that comes this plunge in employment and this plunge in population, and South Bend becomes a really difficult place economically. And we still see the remnants of some of that past with like broken down buildings that are still, some of them are still here in the landscape. And so you get this just kind of very kind of one-dimensional, kind of superficial story of like the heyday of the past, and then the decline post Studebaker, and then maybe in the last 5 or 10 years, like we've been back on the up and up, but you kind of get this vision of everything. But you've been working on a project with Joe Molnar that takes a really well-informed look at that history. What's the frame for the project you guys are working on?
yeah, so it's called More People, and the tagline for it is a article and podcast series about how South Bend lost 50,000 people in 50 years and what we can do about it.
Mm-hmm.
So the articles are all written by Joe, and then the podcast is a collaboration between Joe, myself, and Dustin Mix.
Yeah. So even there, you brought this up in the last talk we had, but if people know a little bit, the narrative is that we lost 30,000 people, right? That we went from about 130,000 to about 100,000 people between the end of Studebaker and where we've been since. 50,000 people, what's that mean?
So 50,000 people means that there are different city boundaries today than there were in 1960 when we were at our population height. So in 1960, we had 132,000 people. Today, we have 101,000 people, which is about a 30,000 person loss. But by the city boundaries of 1960, we actually have about 80,000 people in those city boundaries. And so the reason for us bringing that up is that the effect on the core city, the city that I live in, the city that you live in, is much more pronounced than we're led to believe with that 30,000 number.
Yeah, so that's pretty intense. And for people who are tuning in like from outside, like Jake mentioned, like when we say 30,000 or 50,000, we're talking about, 25, 30, 40% of our population in the city. Yeah. And I think one of the tricky things about that narrative is that places begin to take on a feeling about themselves, and people tend to take on a feeling about places. And the feeling is something like either people want to be there or they don't. Like to just kind of like cut right down to like a gut level morale feeling about a place, right? And places where it feels like people want to be there, there tends to be a sort of collective like uplift and excitement. And then places where the story suggests that people don't want to be there, it can be a real hit to the morale and the esteem of a place, I think. And I think it's fair to say like South Bend's definitely one of those places where I think for a lot of people, not everyone, the feeling has been, this may not be a place people want to be. I think a lot of us would resist that actually. Like, I think you'd probably say, I'd say like, I'm really, really excited about being here in South Bend. Mm-hmm. And yet there's can be this group level sort of narrative. So that can be the feeling, but you and Joe and Dustin, you've been digging into the numbers and the data, and you've discovered the stories just quite a bit different than what I just described, right? So can you take us through maybe a few examples of the data points that tell a different story than the one I just described?
Yeah, so the series starts with this article called No Neighborhood in South Bend Avoided Decline. And Joe looks at 3 kind of example neighborhoods who experienced different levels of population decline from 1960 to 2000. So these are the 40 years after Studebaker closed that we generally think of as these are the years of decline for South Bend. And he starts off by looking at Sunnymead. He lives in Sunnymead, and Sunnymead is, by most accounts, one of the most desirable neighborhoods in South Bend. It hasn't lost, I believe, a single house since they were built. There are no empty lots. If you were to walk through today, you would not be led to believe that Sunnymead has lost population.
Mhm.
But from 1960 to today, or to 2000, Sunnymead lost 20% of its population
Wow.
due to changing family size. And that's something that affected the entire country. That's not something that just happened in South Bend. That's just a cultural reality in America.
Mhm.
And he brought that up to point out that a big chunk of our population loss during that time,
Mhm.
and really like the vast majority of it, was due to changing family size, not people leaving for
Mhm.
different jobs. And in fact, during that time, we
Excuse me.
gained we
Mhm.
gained households.
Okay.
So South Bend during those 40 years gained 800 households,
Mm.
which those are really important for a city because it keeps houses occupied. There aren't vacant and abandoned properties. We don't need to tear houses down, and people are paying property taxes on those.
Mhm.
Even though there are less people in each
Mhm.
of those homes, the homes are occupied, and that's really important for neighborhoods and the funding of a city.
Mhm. I think that's huge. It's so in the aggregate or in the net, right? Like take Sunnymead. It's the story isn't that like people like families just like declined in the neighborhood in terms of units. It's just that a house that might have had two parents and three kids in the 50s might have two parents and one kid, or one parent and two kids today.
Yep.
And you play that out over a neighborhood and you end up with population decline.
Right.
But that's a different nuance than just flight, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and where we really start to see the flight is in the 2000s. And so
Mhm.
this was probably the most surprising finding to me because
Mhm.
I moved here when I was 7 years old in 2001.
Mhm.
And I would have said at the time the decline is over and done. Like the decline started 40 years ago. It has really worked its way out by
Mhm.
now, and
Mhm.
South Bend is kind of just a, you know, a poor city at
Mhm.
this point, and the decline is over. And I was quite wrong, in fact, that there were a lot of reasons to be hopeful at the late 90s and early 2000s, particularly with this household growth. That there weren't vacant and abandoned properties. The people were choosing to live in South Bend,
Mhm.
and largely a lot of those jobs had been replaced. They were not jobs that had filled any of these
Mhm.
old industrial buildings. They were white collar jobs in new buildings downtown and things like that. But there were a lot of jobs. But in the 2000s is when we really saw like the supercharged suburbanization
Mhm.
and moving to unincorporated parts of St. Joe County. People weren't, it's not mostly that people were leaving the county,
Mhm.
it's that people were staying inside the county but moving outside of the city limits. And then
People
couple
that had
that,
the means were opting for the Granger experience if they were able to.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And couple that with the housing market crash in 2008. And South Bend was definitely on the fringe of being able to survive much of any hardship at that point, and we weren't able to. So we went from in those 40 years from 1960 to 2000 gaining 800 households. In those 10 years following, we lost 3,000 households.
Holy cow.
So
That's
300 a year.
yeah, that's a very different perspective than the one you might take away from the narrative the way it's usually told. In fact, I'm going to ask you to say that again, but also somebody's asking a question on Facebook.
Yeah.
Are kids counted in the population as you talk about these numbers, or is it just adults they're asking?
Yep. Yep.
That's
Yeah,
kids.
and we had some people in the comments in these first articles that were like saying something about, yeah, well, uh something about kind of like belittling the role of kids in this, and we were like, well, the kids count as people, and we want them to stay, like, it
Yeah.
matters if they stay here, and they do count in this population. So yeah, all these numbers include kids.
So just to capture what you said right before I asked you that, though, did you see, over what period of time did South Bend gain 800 households?
1960 to 2000.
That's crazy because that's literally the exact window when we often think about the decline. And then you said from 2000 to 2010, we lost 3,000 households.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah, that's a very different story than the one that we hear.
Yeah, which is what left us when Pete came into office and wanted to do the 1,000 homes in 1,000 days. Like,
Mhm.
there's much room to argue about like
Mhm.
how that was done and things like that. But it's not too hard to see that this was like a huge problem at the time. And I don't think that was super well articulated at the time. There were a lot of people that felt like this is a 50-year-old problem. And now you're kind of this young guy coming in and saying, we need to do this now. And we have 1,000 days to do this. And like, why now? This has been going on for 50 years. And like, it's not like Mayor Lickey felt like we needed to do this or anything, but that looking at the data now and this huge loss of households in the 2000 to 2010, it really was just like a raging fire that needed to be put out somehow. Our neighborhoods had a lot of empty homes because of this household loss.
You already began to scratch the surface on employment, but let's talk about that a little more. I think another feeling, I'm a person who, like, when I think about South Bend and like when I want good things for South Bend, like one of my thoughts often turns toward employment and wondering like how we'll get more employment, and like the kind of jobs that really care for people and that provide opportunities for growth and for flourishing.
Right.
Like I think about that all the time, and I wonder about it, and I like if there's a rumor that like some some company's gonna like move here or there's some growth. Also introduce this to your cat, why don't you?
This is Isley.
Hey Isley.
And now that I'm spending all of my time in this chair, we're spending about 8 hours a day together.
Yeah, you guys are buddies.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, let's talk about our employment, because I think there's also a perception that South Bend needs more good jobs, or that we have lost a lot of good jobs or something like that.
Yeah, so this most recent article is called "Jobs Stayed in South Bend, but Employees Left," and it was, if you read the article, Joe explains he wrote this article 100% to respond to comments, and that a lot of the comments in the last 3 articles were just people who don't read the article, and then they comment, well, the jobs left, so people left to get new jobs. It's like really simple. Which is most of the comments that we get are saying like, hey guys, this is simple. Like, you don't need to write all these articles. Why are you spending your time on this? You don't need to redo all this research. All of this is very simple and easily understood. And that's been kind of the point of the series, saying like, it's just not. And so he wrote this article to talk about the reality of the data that South Bend, if you look at the county as a whole, so we're in like boom time for St. Joe County. I don't know if people realize this, but like there's never been more people living in St. Joe County ever than today. St. Joe County is really doing well economically. But when you look at the jobs breakdown between South Bend, Granger, Mishawaka, Notre Dame, and unincorporated parts of the county, a plurality of those good jobs are in South Bend. And South Bend is really the driving force of where people are finding employment. So a large percentage of people who live in Granger, for example, drive into South Bend every day. Our daytime population in South Bend is about 132,000 people. Our population peak, and our nighttime population goes down to about 101. So it's very interesting to see, like, most of these jobs have been replaced, that we think are gone, and they look very different, right? Like, it doesn't look like a big factory where 20,000 people work in one building, which I think makes it a lot harder for us to understand. We still look, and I'm definitely a part of this, that like we still look to those buildings as icons of what it means to be South Bend, what it means to work in South Bend, and have a thriving city. And we tend to not then pay attention to all of this other job growth that has occurred in the last 50 years in maybe less spectacular ways. Because that's just the changing way of work. We don't build buildings like that Studebaker factory anymore, at least not in the middle of the city.
Yeah. Yep. And it's hard when you had such a tangible and easily visible symbol of earlier economic power, and now that's decentralized and it just doesn't show up the same way. It's hard to see it now, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah, and you can see how much we rely on it by just how excited people can get about the
Right.
smallest improvements, right?
Hmm.
Um, and which are great, right? Like I think we should use that building. We should figure out how to use that building, how to renovate that building. But it does expose our like codependency on that building being used and how much we rely on that for our feeling of worth and feeling of value as a city and as like a people in a city.
So when you talk about, I've heard you tell me too that what 3 out of 4 people who work in South Bend don't live in South Bend.
Yeah, 3 out of 4.
Yeah, and we talk about some of these other sort of trends, and I think um, if you really if you sit back with some of that information, right, it begins to underscore. I think when I had a superficial understanding of our history, it can begin to feel sort of like there's an inevitability to the decline, and that the decline is like something that's attached to a company that went bankrupt, and so it just happened to us, and now we sit here sort of um, living in the inheritance of that thing that happened. But the more I hear what you and Joe are working on, and Dustin, the more I think about the the network of choices that we all make, and even right now we are making, like human beings in St. Joe County are making. And I'm not here to like heap a heavy moral burden on some of that, because I know there's a lot of different ways that people think about the decisions they make. And so any individual person, like I'm a Granger kid. I grew up in Granger, and I'm really grateful for how I grew up. And yet, at the same time, like as we try to understand sort of our collective belonging with one another, you start to realize, oh, like some choices are being made, right? And the city is a place that can be looked at as like a lot of need, but if you really think about it, it's also a place where people are kind of popping in, taking what they want, and popping back out if they have the means to do so, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the most troubling stats to me that Joe has published in this series is that um, if you look at the way that the census breaks out racial demographics,
Mm-hmm.
um, white people were the only people to leave South Bend. Every other population grew. The Black population has doubled since our population peak. The Latino population has 10x in that time, and the white population, I don't know the exact amount of how much it decreased, but it's a lot. And it's pretty much it's the only population that decreased, and that I think that should be a troubling thing to us,
Mm-hmm.
and that yeah, like you were saying, like I don't think we're here to yeah make a blanket like moralization of living in the city or living in the suburbs,
Mm-hmm.
but it does get challenging when it bumps up against your stated beliefs about the world. If you you know if you want to like profess Black Lives Matter,
Mm-hmm.
um you have to face the reality that like in South Bend, white people left and left like Black people footing the bill
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of services that those people still use, and they have a job because of those services.
Mm-hmm.
So like these jobs that people who live in Granger or other parts of the county who drive into South Bend to work here, like that job exists because South Bend exists, because South Bend is a city. And like those companies choose to be here and have their offices here. And the reality is that a lot of the richest among us have left the poorest and most vulnerable to foot the bill for that.
Quick call out here. And friends watching, there's this awkward thing where there's like a 30-second delay between me and Jake and when it shows up on Facebook. Because Elias, just as you were talking about, Elias was asking specifically about the decline being almost 100% white. So way to anticipate the needs and speak to that. He said, "Thanks. There's my question." Yeah.
I think Elias. I think if it's the correct Elias, I think Elias moved to South Bend like 3 weeks ago. So
Oh wow.
welcome to South Bend.
Welcome, Elias. Yeah, dude, there's a lot for us to think about there. Like you said, one thing I love about the work that you guys are doing is I think it could be taken a lot of different ways. I think each of us could reflect on it, and it's like the start of a big conversation, I think, that we could keep having, and it might actually lead to some changing perspectives and changing behaviors. And so today we're just scratching the surface, but I just have been tracking with what you're doing for a little while. And for a church who thinks that loving where we are and the people in our community is like part of our calling, like I think love has to include curiosity and understanding and wanting to seek the truth. Those are always things that you do when you love someone or someplace. And so I think you guys are putting some tools in our hands for a church that wants to love South Bend really well, because you're going to help us understand South Bend and think more about what's really going on here. So church friends, highly encourage you to check it out. Again, it's More People, and you can find it on your website, Jake. The article's westsb.com.
Yep.
And you've also got the links there to the podcast, and the podcast is called More People, and it's available wherever you can find a podcast.
Yeah.
That's great. So friends, check it out. Yeah, just a really helpful tool for all of us who want to love South Bend well right now. And then Jake, my favorite part of these Sunday morning social media lives is to give the last word to our guests. So we're giving you the pulpit, man. What do you want to say to our church before we go?
So Joe has started most of these articles with a quote. This is Emery here now making an appearance. But Joe has started most of these articles with a quote from South Bend's past, often found in the Tribune archives. And he started the second or the third article. It's called The Worst Decade in South Bend History, about the 2000s when we had that huge population or the household loss. And he starts it with a quote from Mayor Lloyd M. Allen. Lloyd Allen is the most recent Republican mayor of South Bend. And he was mayor kind of right in the wake of Studebaker closing. So Studebaker closed. Mm-hmm. He was mayor then for, I believe, 8 years. Mm-hmm. And so this is a quote from January 1972, I believe right at the end of his tenure of being mayor. So I'm going to give the last word to Mayor Allen.
Nice.
He says, those who need government services the most, the poor, the elderly, those lacking job skills, will continue living in our city. Those who can afford to take care of themselves, provide the services, and provide the tax base to support municipal services will continue moving out of the city. That must stop. It's the big problem we face in the next decade.
It's a good word, man. Jake, thank you so much, dude. Church, love you, friends. We'll see you tonight.